Now, for more, let's go to Atlanta. Eric Segall teaches law at Georgia State University, the author of Supreme Myths: Why the Supreme Court is Not a Court. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
My pleasure. Good evening.
We heard Donald Trump say he's going to win in the courts. Is that true?
I think it is likely true that he will, mostly because the statute at issue, the National Emergency Act, doesn't define emergency. Now, of course, it should have defined emergency, but it doesn't. So that's going to give the courts, I think, a difficult time overturning what Trump has said, even though you know, I know, and the world knows that there isn't a real emergency at our border.
What did you think when you heard some of the language used by the President of the United States regarding that situation at the border?
I think that the president doesn't have his facts correct. I don't think he cares about that. We know that 90% of illegal drugs come into the United States through ports of entry, not our southern border. We know that the crimes committed by undocumented aliens are down. I think that many of us, certainly not all Americans, but many of us are quite upset that the president doesn't seem to care what the facts are on the ground when taking such an enormous step as declaring a national emergency.
Now, we already have the first lawsuits announced, including the state of New York. Those are elected officials, the state prosecutors in the United States. So does it all just seem like partisan politics, the legal wrangling we're about to witness?
Well, I don't know really how New York has what we call in the United States standing to sue in this case. But in America, virtually all political disputes that are very important end up in the courts. That is not a situation I'm particularly proud of. I've written a lot about how unfortunate that can be. But of course, when a president, any president, does something that is this big, it's going to end up in the courts. And that's not true just for Donald Trump, of course. President Obama's DACA and DAPA, plans ended up in the court. The Affordable Care Act ended up in the courts. This is how we do it here. This is not a particular feature of our system I am proud of, but it is inevitable.
The issue also is, when does the president, and we have the same problem, by the way, here in France, when does the president get to rule by decree?
Well, this, I can't, now I'm not going to hide my bias from your viewers. I'm not a Trump supporter at all. I think saying this is by decree is not exactly accurate. Congress gave him authority to do this. The real legal question in the courts is going to be, has he exceeded that legal authority? And that'll depend on a lot of different factors, one of which is, will the court say this is an emergency or not? This really goes back to Congress's problem in giving our president enormous discretion, which has been used, again, I'm no Trump supporter, but 58 times presidents have declared national emergencies in our country. And I think what this will lead to eventually is Congress re-examining the law. Now, one important point about that, when this law was originally passed in the 70s, both houses of Congress together could stop the president from doing that. In an unrelated case, the Supreme Court held that kind of procedure is unconstitutional. So now Congress can't just stop the president. I'd feel much better if a majority vote in both houses could stop the president, but no longer is that true. The president would have to sign the law. But to call it a decree is maybe not using exactly the right word.
So, yeah, explain this to us. Why is the executive orders, which Barack Obama used a lot, different from here in this particular case?
It's not different in one sense. All of the executive orders that President Barack Obama signed, and I supported some and didn't support some, were, according to his legal authorities, based on a statute passed by Congress. What Donald Trump is doing today, he says, is based on a statute passed by Congress, the National Emergencies Act. Now, I happen to think Obama was right and Trump is on a little bit shakier grounds, but the truth is, because Congress didn't define the word emergency, it is going to be difficult to argue. Now, I will say that Donald Trump said this morning in his own words, and I quote, "I didn't need to do this," end quote. If he doesn't need to do this, it's not an emergency. But that's you and I in common sense talking. That is not asking judges to rule illegal something the president has done, which is always a very serious and should be a very serious situation.
Eric Segall, you're in Georgia, a place in the south of the United States, which is divided. You have people who support one camp, others who support the other. What's the general mood when it comes to the way the president is using the law? Is there consensus? Because we've been hearing all this talk about how some Republicans in Washington feel uneasy with Trump announcing this emergency decree, if you will.
So it depends where you live in Georgia. I live in the city of Atlanta, a huge metropolitan area. We've had African-American governments now since the 70s. My representative is John Lewis, who maybe you've heard of, great civil rights leader in America, stood by Martin Luther King at the marches. So in Atlanta, there is not much love for Donald Trump. If you go 10, 15, 20, 30 miles into Georgia, there is huge support for Donald Trump. And that divide between urban and rural is true all over the country. America, of course, was once divided north-south. Now it is divided rural-urban, and there is a big, big difference. As far as Republicans mumbling their discontent, I think that many of us who are not Republicans are ready for some real action as opposed to mumbling discontent.
Eric Segall teaches law at Georgia State University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.